This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What I want to show you tonight is quieter than that and far more dangerous, because somewhere along the way, power stopped looking like votes or borders or speeches. It started looking like valves, like switches, like who gets access and who doesn't. When those controls move out of sight, everything else becomes theater. Prices, stability, even elections, they follow the same invisible logic. You're told this is about chaos or failure or rescue. But what's actually happening is far more organized than that. It's systematic, and once it starts working in one place, it doesn't stay there. If you stay with me, you'll see how a system can take hold without ever announcing itself, and why, once it does, reversing it becomes almost impossible. Because before you can argue with power, you have to recognize where it moved. And in the next step, I want to show you what's really doing the controlling now. What actually controls the system now is not ideology. It's not legitimacy. It's not even force in the traditional sense. It's control of flow, energy, money, movement. When you can open or close those channels, you don't need to govern directly. You don't need to persuade. You don't even need to occupy. You just manage access. Oil determines prices. Prices determine stability. Stability determines whether people tolerate who's in charge. Cash access decides whether a government can function. Shipping access decides whether trade exists at all. Security guarantees decide who sleeps at night and who doesn't. Once those levers sit outside a country's borders, sovereignty becomes conditional, not removed. Conditional. You comply, you function. You resist, you stall, you collapse quietly. And here's the critical shift. This model doesn't require chaos. It requires order, very deliberate order. The question isn't who governs anymore. It's who controls the valves that governance depends on. And once you see that, the next change becomes harder to ignore, because this didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, and almost everyone agreed to it. There was a time when control looked loud. Sanctions announced, troops deployed, votes counted on camera. And then there is now control is procedural, administrative, buried inside systems that claim to be temporary. Before, intervention was an event. After, it became a process. Before, a country lost power when its government fell. Now it loses power when its infrastructure is managed, when its resources are stabilized, when its revenue is restructured. Nothing appears broken. Nothing looks seized. Everything is described as help. That's the danger of slow change. It doesn't feel like loss. It feels like normalization. Oil flows resume. Markets calm down. Prices adjust. And with every adjustment, decision-making moves one step farther away from the people living with the consequences. This shift didn't require a declaration. It didn't require consensus. It only required patience. Because when a system works, when it lowers prices, restores order, avoids visible war, people stop asking who's actually in control. And that's when the first shock becomes possible, not as a crisis, but as proof. At one point, the system stopped being theoretical. In a single day, billions of dollars worth of oil changed hands. Not through a vote, not through a treaty, through control. The flow was redirected. The asset was secured, and the market responded immediately. Prices eased, stability returned. The shock was absorbed. That moment was presented as success, as efficiency, as proof that the system works, and in one narrow sense, it did. Because nothing spreads faster than a solution that lowers costs and avoids war, especially when the alternative looks like chaos. But here's the part that matters. That transfer didn't just move oil. It moved leverage. Whoever controls that flow decides what gets rebuilt, who gets paid, who gets excluded. And once that happens, politics becomes downstream. Elections become conditional. Recovery becomes permission-based. If you're still watching, keep going. because this wasn't a one-off. It was a demonstration. And the mechanism that made it possible, that's where the real story begins. The system works because it doesn't look like power. It looks like management. When control is framed as rebuilding, nobody asks who set the terms. When control is framed as stabilization, nobody asks who benefits first. When control is framed as preventing collapse, consent becomes automatic. Here's the mechanism. Resources are placed under external coordination. Revenue is routed through approved channels. Spending is monitored, justified, delayed. The country keeps functioning, but it no longer decides. The profits move outward first, the rebuilding comes later. And the risk stays local. Multinational actors gain guaranteed access. Financial systems gain predictability. Political uncertainty is absorbed by people who don't sit at the table. And the people who absorb the damage are told this is temporary, necessary, for their own good. That's how extraction stops looking like extraction. It becomes governance, and once governance is outsourced, resistance gets expensive. Because the system isn't enforced with tanks, it's enforced with denial. No access, no cash, no flow. This is the quiet brilliance of it. And also the danger, because if this is how recovery works, then the next crisis doesn't need to be solved. It just needs to be managed. Then the system accelerates faster than people expect, faster than institutions can respond. Borders feel it first. Suddenly, movement changes, not migration as choice, migration as pressure. People arrive who were never meant to be processed. Criminal networks move with them. Security systems strain quietly, then all at once. This isn't random spillover. It's what happens when a state stops being able or willing to hold what's inside it. At the same time, money tightens, cash access narrows. Transactions fail without explanation. Ships reroute. Insurance spikes. Supply chains hesitate. Nothing explodes. Nothing announces itself as war. But daily life becomes more expensive, more uncertain, more fragile. And every response is reactive, temporary, always one step behind the pressure. Because once flow is disrupted in one place, it seeks release somewhere else. That's how systems behave. And the more the pressure builds, the fewer options remain. Which brings this closer than most people realize. Because the next effect isn't abstract. It's personal. This is where it reaches you. Not as a headline, not as foreign policy. As friction, gas costs more, food takes longer to arrive. Jobs feel less stable than they did last year. You're told it's complicated. You're told it's temporary. You're told this is the price of stability somewhere else. But what you're really experiencing is distance between decision and consequence, between control and accountability. When energy prices rise, it's not abstract. It's your commute, your grocery bill, your ability to plan. When borders strain, it's not theoretical. It's schools, hospitals, local budgets stretched thin. And the most dangerous part is how normal this begins to feel. Because the system isn't failing. It's functioning exactly as designed. If you want to understand why affordability keeps slipping out of reach, why everything feels managed but nothing feels secure, stay with me. Because once this model touches daily life, it doesn't stop there. It scales, and the next place it shows up won't feel distant at all. Once a system like this proves it can travel, it doesn't stay contained. It moves across borders without asking permission, because it doesn't need armies. It needs access. Energy routes realign. Shipping lanes become leverage. Financial systems quietly enforce compliance. What began as stabilization in one place becomes precedent everywhere else. Allies adjust their policies preemptively. Markets price in fear before announcements are made. Governments start negotiating around invisible limits. And the effects compound. When one country loses control of its resources, another recalculates its security. When one currency is cut off, others rush to prove loyalty. When one tanker is stopped, insurance rates ripple across oceans. This isn't global chaos. It's global conditioning. The rules aren't written down, but everyone learns them quickly because the cost of miscalculation is immediate. Delayed shipments, frozen funds, sudden instability. And once nations start adapting behavior to avoid punishment that hasn't even been announced, the system no longer needs to intervene. It governs itself, which raises the final question. If this model keeps accelerating, what does the future actually look like? If this system keeps accelerating, there are only three directions it can go. The first is adjustment. Countries accept the rules quietly. They trade autonomy for predictability. They align early. They survive conditionally. The second is erosion. Control fragments. Compliance becomes selective. Workarounds multiply. Black markets grow where access is denied. Stability holds on the surface. Underneath, legitimacy thins. Trust drains slowly, then all at once. And then there is rupture. That's when pressure exceeds management. When denial replaces negotiation. When systems built to prevent conflict start generating it. Energy becomes a trigger instead of a stabilizer. Sanctions stop deterring and start provoking. Control hardens into confrontation. None of these paths are announced in advance. They reveal themselves through price shocks, through sudden shortages, through decisions that feel inevitable only after they're made. And here's the most dangerous part. Every option looks rational from the inside. Adjustment looks responsible. Erosion looks manageable. Rupture looks unavoidable. The system doesn't tell you which path it's on. It just keeps moving. And by the time you realize which future you're in, the choice is no longer yours. So this is where I'm going to leave you. Not with reassurance, not with resolution. Because systems like this don't end with an announcement. They end with normalization. You don't wake up one morning and discover control is gone. You wake up already adapted to its absence. Prices feel fixed but fragile. Politics feels loud but hollow. Choices exist, but only inside boundaries you didn't draw. And the most dangerous part isn't that this model exists. It's that it works. Quietly, efficiently, without asking for your consent. Once survival depends on permission, permission to trade, permission to move, permission to afford basic life. The question is no longer who's in charge. It's who can say no and who can't. If you want to understand what's coming next, not as speculation, but as structure, you'll want to keep following this because the next phase isn't about foreign countries. It's about how this logic turns inward, how it reshapes democracy without canceling it, and how once you see the system clearly, you start noticing it everywhere. That's where we'll go next.